for us this morning. The two things you never talk about in polite company: religion, politics. In fact, someone had actually mentioned to me after last year we did a series on science and religion. And at the end of the series, somebody said, well, why don't you tackle religion and politics? And I went, I don't know about that. And then I started thinking about it some more, and I thought, there is a lot there, and maybe I should consider it. So I went to some other people, and I said, so what do you think about a sermon series on religion and politics? And they went, I don't know about that. And I think people, even leading up to the series, had kind of been going, what are you going to say, and how are you going to say it? And everybody's been a little questioning. So let me just put aside a few fears this morning, just as we start off. First of all, here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you who God's candidate is. I'm not going to tell you how to vote on particular issues. I'm leaving that up to you. I'm going to allow you to figure that out. I'm going to make some suggestions about how to go about that, but I'm not going to tell you how to do anything. I'm not doing that. I'm also preaching this series as a pastor of a church. And so I'm coming at a perspective from a person of faith, a follower of Christ perspective. I'm not coming at it as a Republican, and I'm not coming at it as a Democrat. I even was worried about whether I should wear a blue tie today or not. Because, some people are going to say, oh, he's wearing a blue tie, it must be, and next week I'll wear a red tie, don't worry. So, I'm trying to be very bipartisan in the approach is what I'm saying, and come at it from a pastoral perspective, a spiritual perspective, and a person of faith and a follower of Christ. So just a little bit about what we're not going to say and what the purpose of, and really today we're going to be looking at the relationship between religion and politics, talk about church and state, and next week we're going to look at power. Jesus never really was a political leader. And he didn't really say a whole lot about politics, but he had a lot to say about power and authority and how to wield it. And we'll look at that next week, about power and politics. And then the third week, we'll take a look at the relationship between us as citizens of a nation called the United States, and how do we, if we as a person of faith, how do we engage and figure out and navigate the relationship between being a citizen and being a follower of Christ and our person of faith. And so we'll be looking at that in the third week. So to get us thinking today, let's take a look at this on the street video video that we have on the street. All right. As you can see, there's a lot of passion around the issue of religion and politics, and I know there's a lot of passion. And so I think one of the things we have to think about is this, how do we manage these two worlds, religion, politics, church, and state? And interestingly enough, we heard from the Old Testament this morning, kind of what I would call the first separation of church and state, which was in the Bible. Because at this point in time, up to this point where Samuel's a judge. Now, a judge was someone like Moses. He was a spiritual leader and a political leader. Because the nation of Israel was under what's called a theocracy. So a democracy is ruled by the people. A theocracy is ruled by God, right? A theocracy, God. And so they had been under a theocracy. God was their leader. God was their king. They were to be a holy nation, a royal priesthood. And so the Israelites understood this, and they understood that the judge was that leader that God had raised up to be their spiritual and political leader and military leader. So this is the first time in Israel's history where the people, a democracy, the first democratic action, they come and they say, give us a king. And actually they were asking for monarchy, not for democracy. But when they asked this request of Samuel, they're in a sense saying, we want somebody else to be our military and political leader. And Samuel, you spiritual, and then leave the spiritual leadership to the priests and the prophets. And so they're asking for a separation of church and state. I think that's kind of human nature, isn't it? I mean, there are certain areas of our lives we'd like to keep God out of, right? It's hard for us to navigate and keep them together. And so it's easier for us sometimes just to compartmentalize and put God in a place and put politics in a place. And so that's natural for us to do as human beings. And so that's what the people were asking for. They were also, in a sense, asking for a king because they had looked around all the other nations and they had seen they had kings. And so this is kind of keeping up with the Joneses, or in this case, keeping up with the Canaanites. The Canaanites had a king, so we need a king, right? The other interesting thing, there's a distinction, we'll talk a little bit about this too in a little bit. there's also a distinction between Israel's king and the king of the other nations, because the kings of other nations were in themselves considered God. Does that make sense? Remember, Caesar was considered a god, worshipped as a god. In the Canaanite culture, the king was considered a god. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was considered a god. And so we have to keep that in mind. But in the nation of Israel, the king was not equated with God. In fact, the king was actually to be a person of faith and to follow God's law and respect God. And so that's a distinction in this understanding of kingship and this separation for the Israelites to ask for a king and to separate out God's leading from the state, or the church from the state. So there's been a whole lot of debate throughout. I mean, I've been in the church and I've been around for a while, separation of church and state, and what did our founding fathers intend in doing that? And so I'm going to take us down a little trip down memory lane. Okay, go back in history a little bit, say, what is going on. So let's take a little trip down into history, and you're going to, if you brought your government textbooks with you, pull those out at this point. So what was the intent of our founding fathers to keep these, and was their intent to keep these two worlds totally separate? So it's clear from the very beginning that religion was influencing the shape of our nation. So, for example, does anybody know, and I'm assuming you don't, what the first act of the Continental Congress was? Anybody want to take a guess? Yes. Prayer, exactly. The very first act of the Continental Congress was a call to prayer. They brought in a pastor to come before the Continental Congress. He read from Psalm 31, and then he gave a heartfelt extemporaneous prayer. That's what John Adams says in his journal. And John Adams talks about this act of Congress being the first act and how appropriate that was. And they were a little worried about it because they had Quakers and Anabaptists and Episcopalians and Congregational. They were wondering how people were going to respond. But John Adams reports that was the most heartfelt prayer, and it seemed to unify the Continental Congress and seemed to bring them all together in purpose. And that this prayer was the very first act of our nation. That prayer was the one thing they turned to in this time of making a very important decision in our country's process of forming our country. It's interesting, you may wonder, well, why did they do that? Well, 29 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence had seminary degrees. So a lot of them, they weren't necessarily pastors, but they had gone to seminary. So these were men of faith and men who had religious values working in their lives. And so they felt it important to bring God into the political process that they were coming into. You also see that reflected in the Declaration of Independence. How many people have read the whole Declaration of Independence before? Good. And I thought I'd read it here this morning. You guys ready for that? No, I'm not going to do that. You guys will be like going out for another cup of coffee. But I want to read the very beginning, and I want to read the end of the Declaration of Independence, because those are the two places where we see God reflected within that declaration. And the first part of the declaration will be very familiar to you, because it says this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Everybody remember those words, right? Martin Luther King quoted those words in his speech. At the end of the Declaration, after they go through a long list of grievances against the British Crown, they finally declare their independence here in the last paragraph. I'll read that paragraph to you. "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of the Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Powerful words that shaped our nation. The other thing that was in there, but what I started to see was the references to God. The references to say that we're appealing to God. We're asking for God's will to be done. We're appealing to God's justice in this process. What I appreciate about our forefathers is what they didn't do. What they didn't do was say, God told us to do this. Does that make sense? They didn't say, we're doing this in the name of God. We're hoping that we're appealing to God and God's justice, but we're not claiming that God is telling us to do this. They're not playing what I call the God card. Does that make sense? Have you ever known somebody to play the God card on you? You know, God told me. You know, and that God card, how do you trump that, right? I mean, it's like playing card. You know, there's a trump card, and there's one card in the deck that trumps all the other cards. When you play the God card, like, who do you appeal above that? I mean, that. The danger in doing that is exactly what we're going to remember this week on 9/11, isn't it? Somebody played the God card on our nation. Somebody said, well, God wants me to fly a plane into the World Trade Center to get even or get back at, and say that this is God's leading. Now, again, that's not about the whole faith of Islam, but that's about people who misinterpreted and saw God as them telling them to do this. And there's a very big danger in doing that. I know pastors in the past who, coming up on presidential elections, have said, this is God's candidate for presidency. In a sense, what they're doing is they're playing the God card, and there's a danger in doing that. So that's why I'm not doing that. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to stand here and say, this is God's candidate. I'm going to let you figure out who God is leading you to, and we'll talk about that as well. So the intent there for the Founding Fathers, so you notice that their faith is influencing their political actions. Does that make sense? And yet at the same time, these men, after the Revolutionary War, came together in Congress and they began to create the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was that document that formed our government, that says this is how we're going to organize ourselves as a nation and as a government. And in that, they wrote the Constitution, they organized themselves, and they proposed amendments to that. There were several, I think about 10 amendments originally that were proposed to the Constitution in 1789. Then they were ratified by all the states in 1790. One of the amendments, the First Amendment, does anybody know? All right, government lesson this morning. First Amendment rights. In the Bill of Rights, amended to the Constitution, does anybody remember one of the things, the freedoms that we have that may be applicable to us today? Speech, yes. What else? Right to assembly. Right. Was right to bear arms in there? I'm going to have to go check on that, but I think right to bear arms is one of the amendments. But in the that's the Second Amendment. First Amendment is free speech, freedom to petition, I think, freedom of the press, and also freedom of religion. Well, the one thing I want to talk about is the freedom of religion, all right? Can we get that? Now I got to go back and check I did research this week, and I thought I had them all down. But one that we want to look at this morning is the freedom of religion. Because in the First Amendment is this phrase in the Constitution: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what's happening here is actually Madison and Jefferson both said there should be this great barrier that should exist between church and state. They were setting up this great barrier, or what they call the great barrier, between these two things. Two reasons. One is that they're saying is that the government should never play the God card. The government should never say, this is the religion of the state. This is the one that's the official religion. They had experience with that, didn't they, in another country previously, Church of England, and under the British Crown. So they knew there was a danger in doing that, so they didn't want to do that. The other thing that they're also doing is there was, at that time, many denominations in the United States. In fact, the first state to pass the Freedom of Religion Act before the Constitution was even created was the great state of Maryland. That's right. Maryland was the first state to actually come up with this idea of freedom of religion as one of the colonies in one of the states. The reason being is because there was a heavy concentration of Catholics in Maryland as well as Protestants. And do you think the Catholics and the Protestants got along in our great state of Maryland? No. So they passed a law, they passed an act that was religious freedom, so there wouldn't be any persecution between Protestants and Catholics. And so then the United States also adopted that within their Constitution. Maryland led the way, so we should feel good about that, right? Our state led the way in that. And so that's where this is coming from, but that we shouldn't ever prohibit somebody, the government should never prohibit or get in the way of someone exercising their religion or worshiping God. And we know many countries around the world where people are told what religion to follow and are not allowed to express their faith if they're a Christian. And we actually have people who are persecuted around the world because of that. And so we need to keep that in mind. And so in a sense, what the founding fathers were doing is seeing the danger of playing the God card as a nation. And they wanted to prevent against that in the future, which is probably a wise thing to do. So in the government, it's as a role as a governing body and as the government, it's good to keep the separation of church and state. Yet, I'm not sure that their intention was to say, keep faith out of politics. Does that make sense? So for the government, that may be true, but for politicians, for individuals, that faith and politics, that's a little bit harder to do, isn't it? Because if I'm a person of faith, and I'm going to have certain values and things that are going to be important to me as a person of faith that is going to influence me and should influence me, whether I'm in politics or even just a citizen voting. And so I'm not so sure. I think like the founding fathers, their faith did influence their political decisions, even though they saw the great need to keep church and state separate. So they were able to make the distinction between those two. I'm not sure that we always get that distinction clear. So the next question that comes to my mind, I don't know if it comes to your mind. So, the nation, let's go back to Old Testament. Old Testament, the king was to be a person of faith. And the king was to follow God's laws and respect and fear God. The other two things that the king was supposed to do was not be too wealthy and not have too many wives. The reason, everybody always laughs at the wives part. The reason was because if the king married wives from other nations, that he might be led astray to the values or the gods of those other nations. So the king was not to take on too many wives or too much wealth. And yet we see Solomon, who's one of the greatest kings in the Bible, taking on a lot of wealth and a lot of wives. So, so we got a little bit difference there. But in general, when they set up the king was to be a person of faith. And so that brings us to a question: should the President of the United States be a person of faith? Should I vote for someone based on their religion? Or should I vote for this candidate because they're religious and this candidate? So that's a good question, isn't it? And this is an interesting year, isn't it? Because for the first time in U.S. history, there are no white Protestant males running for president or vice president. Both the vice presidents are Catholic, and the president is a Protestant mainline United Church of Christ member, and the other candidate, the Republican candidate, is Mormon. And so let's take this. So should religion be the litmus test for our vote is my question. Should it be the only thing that we're looking at? Should that be the trump card? Well, if it is, we're in trouble. Keep in mind, here's two good examples. Adolf Hitler publicly professed to be a Christian. Abraham Lincoln did not. Abraham Lincoln never joined a church, never professed Christ or made any declaration of faith that we're aware of publicly. So if we had voted based on religion, in both those cases, we would have got it wrong, wouldn't we? We would have got it wrong. Because we know there's more to that presidency than just that religion. We also have to think of leadership, experience, skills, and what I think we mostly look at is how do they align with my values? How do they align around these political issues? And that's where it gets complicated, doesn't it? That's where we get confused, I would say. Because you got this group over here saying these are the issues that God is leading us to support, and you've got this group over here saying these are the issues that God is leading us to support. Little God card thing going on. That's what makes it hard for us, doesn't it? Here's what my experience has been throughout my career as a pastor is I know good Christian, faithful people on both sides of every issue. I know good people who are taking a side and will get very passionate about that, and their faith is leading them to take that stance. And I can point to another person of faith on the other side just as passionate about their stance. And they're both saying, my faith is informing this. My faith is influencing this. And that's where it gets hard to navigate. You know, there are all kinds of issues that I know people are standing up on in terms of the different ways that they do that, and the different issues that are out there. You know, the environment, gay marriage, immigration, the economy, job creation. What else? There are all these issues that people of good faith are on both sides, and good candidates are on both sides. So that's where it gets complicated. So who do you vote for? How do you make that decision? What issues should we support? Now, I'm not going to tell you, but I'm going to give some advice. I generally agree that if all things were equal, if all candidates were equal in skill and leadership ability and all those great things, equally qualified candidates, if I knew there was one candidate that would turn to God to make decisions and to pray and bring their faith to bear in those situations, I would probably lean towards that candidate. I don't know who that, I'm not saying I know who that candidate is. What I'm saying is that I hope that whoever is the leader of our nation, just like there was a king who was a leader of the Israelites, I hope that that would be a person who would bring their faith to bear upon the important decisions they have to make. I know as being a leader in a church that there's a cost to leadership. That there are times where you have to make a decision based on the information you have and nobody else has it. But you know when you make that decision that people aren't going to be happy. It's not going to be popular. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And you are basing that decision on only the information you have, and you can't tell anybody why you're making that decision, and you know they're going to be upset. That's the cost of leadership. And those are the moments where I go to God, and I go, God, I need your help with this decision. I want to do what is best for the people. I want to do what's best for all involved here. I want to do what's best, and I want to know what your best is, God, in this situation. So I pray. I talk to God. My faith comes to bear upon that. I hope that the leader of our nation would do the same. Because there are times when the leaders of our nation have to make vitally important decisions that affect all of us. And I want them to know that they're doing the best, making the best decision for all the information they have, and I think they need God's guidance to do that. Just as the founding fathers did that. They brought their faith to bear upon that decision. I too hope that we put people in elected leadership that do that. The other thing is I hope that we do that. Not just our leaders, but that I hope that we pray, that we ask God the question, that we go, but that we pray before we get into that voting booth. It would be very hard for me as a follower of Christ to go to the voting booth and say, Jesus, I'm going to need you to wait outside while I go vote. Because when I go into the voter booth, Christ's values come with me. My relationship with God comes with me. How I think comes with me. It's a part of who I am. And I pray, and I hope that God helps me with that decision. And I trust, because we're a democracy, that God works through all that. That's where I'm trusting that God's at work. Even if I don't agree. Even if I don't think we get it right in the end. I'm also going to trust that God has a bigger plan. So I think we need to do that. So, you want to know who to vote for this fall? Would you like to know? Just write my name in. I'm kidding. Do not do that to me. It's hard. It's tough enough being a pastor of church. But here's a promise from God. Here's God's promise to us. James 1:5 says this: if you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. God's promise to us is that God will give us the wisdom for the decisions we need to make. Amen.